We've all seen a tree with a trunk that splits into branches, then into smaller branches, and finally into leaves, each of which has its own little network of veins. In mathematics, this can go on forever. In nature, it'll stop at the cellular level. In architecture, we can find similar kinds of order, again with the solidity at the base, getting lighter as it rises, and examples from the west to the east, with self-similar geometry across a multitude of scales that only really breaks down when you start getting to the molecular level. Uprisings in architecture, how human-centered design is making a comeback, sums up the direction I want to explore. How architecture can reconnect with the human experience by linking fractal geometry and classical proportion across both Western and Eastern traditions. I'm drawing from examples like Palladio and Borromini in the west, and Sanchi's Stupa and Taj Mahal in the east, buildings that embody a kind of living order. What they share are patterns that resonate biologically, forms that our eyes, brains, and bodies naturally respond to. And when we understand that connection, we start to see a path toward bridging modernity and tradition and restoring harmony in the built environment. One of the most fascinating shifts in architecture today is that neuroscience is beginning to validate what traditional builders always seemed to know intuitively, that our environments affect how we think, feel, and even heal. On our podcast, we've had several contributors to the Routledge Handbook of Neuroscience and the Built Environment talk about this exact connection. Beauty, proportion, and coherence aren't just aesthetic preferences. They're tied to how our brains process spatial information. So rather than treating architecture as an abstract art form, we can start to understand it as something deeply biological and perceptual, something that literally shapes our mental and emotional well-being. You've probably heard the word fractal before. It describes a kind of geometry that repeats itself at many different scales. We see this everywhere in nature, in the branching of trees, the veins of a leaf, the way coastlines or river systems divide and flow. By the way, there are anecdotes of standing on the beach, seeing a seashell in front of you, and then you walk 49 steps and you see another seashell, and then you walk 51 steps and you see another seashell, and then you walk 50 steps and you see another seashell. And on an average of every 50 steps or whatever it happens to be there, you'll see a similar kind of seashell. And maybe every 5 seashells, it'll be a larger one, or it'll have some kind of fractal nature. It's like embedded into the world we live in. This pattern isn't just visually interesting. It's something our bodies recognize. As Dr. Richard Taylor and others have shown, the human visual system actually evolved to process fractal patterns. Exposure to mid-range fractals, those with the complexity dimension between about 1.3 and 1.5, can reduce stress levels by up to 60%. That means that fractals aren't just beautiful, they're biologically resonant. Our brains process them efficiently because they mirror the same branching, recursive logic that exists in our neurons, lungs, and circulatory systems. So when we introduce fractal geometry into architecture, we're not adding decoration, we're tuning the built environment to human physiology. So now that we know why fractals resonate with us, the next question is, what isn't fractal? This is where a lot of modern design gets it wrong. A grid looks ordered, but it's actually a very shallow kind of order because every square is the same. There's no change in scale, no evolution of pattern as you zoom in. It's uniform, and that uniformity is what makes it non-fractal. By contrast, true fractals show self-similarity across multiple scales. Here you can see 3 examples: the Menger sponge, the Sierpinski gasket, and the fractal tree. Each one repeats, but with variation, and that variation is what gives it depth, complexity, and life. Architecture built purely on a grid tends to feel flat, mechanical, and disconnected, while fractal-inspired forms invite the eye to travel, to discover relationships across levels of scale. That's the same principle we see in nature, and as we'll see later, in the world's most enduring architecture. In classical architecture, every part of a building and every element within it carries its own bottom, middle, and top. You can see that clearly across the 5 classical orders: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. But also within each individual column assembly, starting from the bottom, we have the pedestal. It has its own bottom, middle, and top: the plinth, the dado, and the cornice. Above that, the column itself, again, has a bottom, middle, and a top: the base, the shaft, and the capital. And finally, the top, the entablature, which is also divided into 3 parts: the architrave at the bottom, the frieze in the middle, and the cornice at the top. What's beautiful is that this layering of order doesn't stop there. Each of those pieces, especially in the more ornate orders, has its own microstructure: smaller tops, middles, and bottoms that repeat and refine the hierarchy. So even without modern mathematics, the classical builders created a kind of fractal hierarchy, a system of proportion and rhythm that carries meaning from the whole down to the smallest detail. What we're looking at here is a sketch I made of Palazzo Barberini, a perfect example of how order within order becomes visible on the facade itself. When a building rises through 3 stories, one of the classical approaches is to assign a different order to each level: Doric on the first floor, Ionic on the second floor, and Corinthian on the third. This creates a sense of refinement as you move upward. Structurally, it makes sense. The Doric at the bottom is thick and strong, carrying the most load. The Ionic in the middle is lighter and more slender, and the Corinthian at the top is the thinnest and most ornate and takes the least load. But visually, it also adds a kind of fractal harmony. Each floor has its own order, its own capital, its own rhythm, distinct yet related, giving the facade self-similarity with variation. So as the structure diminishes in scale, the ornament increases in refinement, creating one harmony made out of many harmonies, just like in nature. This project, that's about 2,500 years old, was inscribed in 1986 on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Before the vertical stacking of classical orders became common in later Western architecture, we see a remarkable early example of hierarchical thinking at the Temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassae, designed by Iktinos around 420 BCE, the same architect associated with the Parthenon. Instead of placing Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders on different levels, as architects would do centuries later in buildings like Palazzo Barberini, which we just saw, Iktinos arranged them horizontally, side by side. As you move inward, you encounter Doric first, sturdy and elemental, then Ionic, more refined, and finally at the center, the earliest known Corinthian capital, the most delicate and ornate. So here, long before the vertical hierarchy of later classical facades, Iktinos creates a processional hierarchy, a sequence of increasing refinement as you move through space on the ground. It shows that classical architecture wasn't limited to hierarchy by height. It could also unfold horizontally, as an experiential journey toward the sacred center. You see here the geometry is swooping and curving, but the path is straight. This is the Paris Opera House, designed by Charles Garnier in the 19th century, one of the most theatrical buildings ever created. What makes it so compelling is how it balances clarity and richness at the same time. The plan combines linear circulation with layered curves, showing that order and exuberance can coexist. On these monumental stairs, the body moves in a straight line, but the space dances around it with arches, balconies, and sweeping curves that seem to swirl as you ascend. The geometry is elaborate, yet never confusing. You always understand where you are, even as the building surrounds you with motion, reflection, and ornament. It's a perfect demonstration that clarity doesn't exclude richness, it frames it. Architecture at its best lets us move through complexity without losing our sense of direction. Simplicity and extravagance, 2 paths to architectural richness. On the left is Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda, on the right, Francesco Borromini's San Carlo, alle Quattro Fontane. These 2 works reveal how very different approaches can both lead to architectural richness. Palladio achieved it through clarity and proportion, a perfect symmetry of forms, anchored in simple geometry and repetition. Everything feels measured, serene, and inevitable. Many seem to cite this as the greatest residence ever made. Borromini, on the other hand, reaches richness through complexity and movement. The surfaces twist, the geometry pulses, and the space breathes. It's exuberant rather than restrained, and yet still deeply ordered. What connects them is that both are coherent at every scale. Whether it's the calm of Palladio or the turbulence of Borromini, each builds a self-consistent world, a reminder that harmony doesn't mean sameness. There are many paths to beauty, but both depend on geometry, proportion, and the human response to pattern. At the Taj Mahal, when you look at the site plan, you see a central pool of water with channels extending out of it that split the ground into 4 quadrants. Each of those quadrants is split into 4 gardens, and each of those 4 gardens has 4 parts to it, which if you look closely are further divided into 4s. The floor plan of the main mausoleum has 4 quadrants to it, and it's got a very intricate floral pattern embedded into the white marble. When you look at the elevation of the Taj Mahal's mausoleum, you see the floral pattern that has elements reminiscent of a pointed arch, and the doors and windows are pointed arches, and sometimes a collection of pointed arches like a door and a window are absorbed by a larger indent of an embedded pointed arch, and the overall silhouette of the building looks like a pointed arch. So you start seeing the fractal nature of the architecture. Of course, it's not infinite like a mathematical fractal, because it will start to break down when you get down to the molecules, but you get so many levels of scale that you perceive it like an infinite fractal. You've also got the minarets that are like slimmed down, but elongated and stretched out versions of the entire building, placed at the 4 corners, and you have those appearing at different scales and becoming denser toward the center of the building. The Taj Mahal is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's a reminder that true unity in architecture doesn't come from simplicity alone, but from a relationship, when every scale speaks the same visual language, from the ground plan to the smallest ornament. The Great Stupa at Sanchi, another UNESCO World Heritage Site, shows how pure geometry and rich ornament can coexist in harmony. Its central form is a perfect hemisphere, simple, abstract, and symbolic of the cosmos. That stillness is what gives it presence. Around it, the carved gateways, or toranas, bring the human story to life, covered with elephants, lions, and human figures. These carvings don't compete with the dome, they frame the experience of it. What's beautiful is how the architecture changes with scale. From a distance, we read the pure geometry of the dome, but as we approach, we engage the sculpture. Stories carved at eye level, meant to be discovered through movement. It's a perfect example of how form and ornament can express different registers of meaning, the eternal and the earthly, all within one coherent design. You might have noticed that all the examples we've looked at so far have bilateral symmetry. For most of architectural history, symmetry was how we expressed harmony, how buildings related to both the human body and the natural world. But after the First World War, that changed. At first, minimalism became the new ideal, then with postmodernism, elements out of place became the new ideal, then with deconstructivism, asymmetry and rupture became the new ideal, replacing balance and reflection. There's a simple little rule you'll find in a lot of traditional architecture: an even number of columns and an odd number of bays. What it does is really beautiful. It creates a real center, a natural place for a doorway or access to a line. You can see it again and again. The Temple of Apollo at Bassae has 6 columns and 5 bays. The Paris Opera has 12 columns and 11 bays. Palazzo Barberini, 8 columns and 7 bays. That odd number of bays means there's always a middle, something for the eye to settle on and for the body to move toward. It's one of those small geometric ideas that makes the architecture feel centered, balanced, and human. But when you flip that, when you have an odd number of columns and an even number of bays, something interesting happens. The center is no longer a doorway or a place to stand. It becomes a column, a piece of structure right in the middle. You can see that in Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, which has 5 columns and 4 bays. You can argue that the geometry is still balanced, but the focus shifts. Instead of space being centered on people, the structure itself becomes the visual and conceptual center. It's a subtle change, but it captures a much larger shift in modern architecture, from framing human experience to celebrating the system that holds it up. This research comes from Ann Sussman and Abigail Seekley in Chapter 6 of the Routledge Handbook of Neuroscience in the Built Environment, a study on how we visually engage with architecture. Using eye tracking software, they compared how people's eyes move across different facades, what's called first fixation, or where our attention goes the moment we see a building. In the top pair, you see 2 federal buildings in Washington, D.C., the Robert C. Weaver building on the left and the William Jefferson Clinton building on the right. In the bottom pair, the U.S. Courthouse in Toledo on the left and the Hanson Federal Building in Utah on the right. What they found is striking. People's eyes linger on the more traditional buildings, drawn to the windows, doors, and human-scale details, while their gaze tends to bounce off the blank, abstract, modern ones. It's a visual reminder that our brains are wired to look for faces, order, and meaning, and that architecture still communicates most powerfully when it meets us at the level of perception. Figure 6.6 of the Routledge Handbook of Neuroscience in the Built Environment shows heat maps of visual focus on a house in upstate New York, contrasted with an image of the same building with its windows removed. It shows us that the brain has a built-in face bias, heading gaze to a face-like pattern and away from a blank one without even conscious control. Figure 6.3, a vast study of a public art college, Mass Art in Boston, and the historic house in colonial Williamsburg. This one shows, through heat maps, how our brains are hardwired to process objects with bilateral symmetry around the vertical axis faster. These are Christopher Alexander's 15 Properties of Living Structure, described in The Nature of Order, Volume 1, at the top, and images of Echmiadzin in Armenia at the bottom. One of the world's oldest cathedrals and another UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can see it's got the bilateral symmetry and really exemplifies Alexander's 15 properties: levels of scale, strong centers, boundaries, alternating repetition, positive space, good shape, local symmetries, deep interlock and ambiguity, contrast, gradients, roughness, echoes, the void, simplicity and inner calm, and not separateness. The geometry unfolds in layers, strong centers nested within boundaries, and ornament that echoes the structure. For the need for small blocks, I'm referencing Jane Jacobs and her classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She wrote that most blocks must be short, streets and opportunities to turn corners must be frequent. What she's talking about is human connection. When blocks are short, people see each other more often. There are more accessible storefronts, more eyes on the street, and more chances for casual encounters. All the things that make a city feel safe and alive. But when blocks stretch too long, they start to work against that. They become more isolated, fewer people walking by, fewer places to turn, and that isolation often leads to more theft and crime because there's less public visibility. Jacobs understood that good urban design isn't just aesthetic, it's social. A network of small blocks keeps movement flowing and the community visible. This slide shows two very different ways of thinking about how we organize cities. On the left, you've got centralized zoning, the modernist approach where every function is separated, housing here, offices there, retail somewhere else. It's efficient on paper, but in practice, it creates monotony. You end up with long commutes, empty streets at certain hours, and neighborhoods that don't really feel alive. On the right is dispersed zoning, where functions mix more naturally, shops, homes, schools, cafes, all woven together. That mix creates variety, and that variety keeps people out, keeps streets alive, and creates a sense of belonging. You could almost say the difference is between a machine and an ecosystem. One is planned top down, the other grows bottom up. When you think about it, the human city has always been the latter. This slide is about something every creative field shares, that stretch of time where you're just grinding through and it feels like nothing's working. In Pittsburgh, Dr. Jonas Salk and his team spent years on a killed virus approach to the polio vaccine. They faced slow progress, constant setbacks, and a lot of skepticism from other researchers. It was what Salk later called his basement years, that phase before the breakthrough when all you see are dead ends. Eventually, he took a step back, traveling to Assisi, where he found clarity and light and came back with a renewed vision for his research. I think that story resonates deeply with the process of architecture too. When you're sketching, modeling, or revising, there's that same rhythm of failure, reflection, and rediscovery. Sometimes the breakthrough only comes after you've lived through the dead ends. So it was after years of intense lab work in Pittsburgh when Jonas Salk took the trip to Assisi in 1954. He later said that it was there, surrounded by stone, light, and quiet, that he found the mental clarity he'd been missing. It wasn't a breakthrough in the lab sense, it was a breakthrough in perception. He started to see that the environment you work in can shape how you think. When he returned to the US, he brought that feeling with him and hired Louis Kahn to design the Salk Institute, wanting to recreate that same atmosphere. It has stone, openings toward the sunlight, and a courtyard open to the Pacific, architecturally echoing, in a sense, what Salk found in Assisi. It's a reminder that the spaces where we think and create can directly influence the quality of what we create. Christopher Alexander and Peter Eisenman are both legendary architects in their own right, but when they debated each other, what I was really struck by was Alexander's insistence that architecture and design should be considered objectively. And this quote of his really stood out to me. In order to find out what's really comfortable, it is necessary to mock up the design at full scale. When a group of different people set out to try and find out what is harmonious, their opinions about it will tend to converge if they're mocking up full-scale, real stuff. Of course, if they're making sketches or throwing out ideas, they won't agree. But if you start making the real thing, one tends to reach agreement. So this whole presentation actually grew out of a paper I wrote for the upcoming conference. That paper, in turn, grew out of the podcast. The conversations with Nikos Salingaros, Nir Buras, Ann Sussman, and many others became a kind of ongoing research project, a place where ideas could form, get challenged, and evolve in real time. I'm not ready to share the paper publicly yet. It still needs another proofread and some edits, but this presentation is really the refined version of those ideas. It's a synthesis of all those discussions, sketches, and studies, a way of seeing how theory, design, and dialogue can all converge into one living process. These are the sources I used in case you want to go to them directly. Thank you very much. Wishing you tons of peace and positivity, and I'll catch you in the next video. Adios.